Hello, this is Mark Tucker,
And I'm Alan Furstenberg.
and we're Two Voice Devs. So Alan, what have you been working on this last week?
It's been a busy week for me, aside from a power outage that I had midweek.
Oh,
Um, I've been helping a lot of people kind of understand how to use Action Builder and how to use Multivocal with it, which is an open source project that I've been working on. And I know you've been working on some really big open source projects as well. Why don't you talk a little bit about Speech Markdown?
sure. So yeah, Speech Markdown is one of the many open source projects that I've been working on. But that's a project that I started. Oh man, just a little bit of history, I guess. 2016 is when I started doing voice stuff. 2017, started looking at SSML, which is speech synthesis markup language, and it's how you format the text-to-speech content. So if you want to put emphasis on a certain word, if you want to say things in a certain way, slow the rate down, pronounce things correctly, put audio. So that's all incorporated in SSML. And actually, SSML is pretty old. If I remember correctly.
Yeah, when I started looking into SSML, is one of the things that really surprised me is that it dates from relatively early days of the web, and none of the big people that are using it neither Amazon nor Google were authors of the original specification.
Yeah, not at all. Yeah. So 2004 version 1 of the SSML spec came out, and then 2010 it was revised with like a 1.1 version of it. But that is the I guess the mechanism that the two main platforms and even Bixby now as well have chosen to do their formatting of output. And what I noticed in 2017 is that one, no single platform supported the entire SSML spec. And in fact, they supported different things than each other, and sometimes they added their own custom tags to SSML. So that's something that I summarize in a website that you can still see today. It's ssml.guru, and it compares the different voice platforms and what tags. And if you've programmed in HTML, then it's a very similar concept. It's XML based, so you have your beginning tag, end tag, and then you have your different tags and attributes based on how you want to format your speech output. And so that's where I started from on this project, and noticing that things were different. And so it just got me thinking in a number of ways. One, there's this cross-platform problem that if I'm writing SSML cross-platform on something like Jovo, then depending on which request is coming in, then the SSML flavor on the output could be different or would need to be different depending on what tags were supported and what tags weren't. So that was one kind of impetus for Speech Markdown. The other being that a lot of people don't want to code in HTML or in SSML and in the voice world. And so I was making some connections and some parallels. So what would people do today if you're writing a blog or doing anything content-wise on the web? What would be the tools that you would use? Mostly you would use some sort of a WYSIWYG editor, but behind the scenes, it's probably converting that into HTML. So I was wondering what we could do on the speech side of things. And so one of the ways that you can write HTML is through Markdown. It's just a simplified syntax. A word between asterisks is bold. You have tags for inserting hyperlinks, just different things. And so I was wondering how would that look if we did the same thing for voice text to speech. So that's where I came up with the idea of Speech Markdown. So it's basically a simplified format for doing text to speech, targeted at what I'm calling content authors. So that's a broader audience than just your typical developer and designer. I use it too as a developer, and it's great. I like the fact that I can code things cross-platform, do things in Speech Markdown, and it worries about the specific flavor of SSML that I need for whatever platform
No, that makes a lot of sense.
being
And I
responded
think
to.
also, you know, certainly from my experience, both with it and with regular Markdown, is that you can express concise things, express things very concisely. So instead of having to do, you know, a lot of verbose tags, you've got those verbose tags in just a few characters surrounding the specific words or phrases or whatever that you want to make sure get emphasized.
Yeah, so for example, if you wanted to make something as an emphasis, there are some, you know, some tags that you could put, like plus signs on either side of something, and it will do an emphasis, or 2 plus signs would make it even more emphasis. So there's some shortcut ways, but the typical way that you would apply these speech markdown tags would be parentheses around the word or phrase that you want to modify, and then square brackets after that with 1 or more attributes. Also, part of the problem, when I first started, I didn't know my prosody from my phoneme, because I'm not a linguist. And so that confused me, and I think it would confuse a lot of people. And so, you know, we're used to saying things like the rate of speech is this fast, or the pitch is high, and so that's what the prosody tag is all about, and it has attributes for rate and things. And so I thought, let's just get rid of prosody. We don't need to know that.
Right.
So
you know,
so you just say the rate is this, and the, you know, the pitch is this, and you know, just get rid of some of those words that are going to confuse people from the get-go.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and that resonates a lot with some of that actually got inspired parts of multivocal as well. So that resonates a great deal.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about multivocal.
Oh, so multivocal does not have nearly the same level of adoption that speech markdown has. So it's an open source library that I wrote, I guess, shortly after I started using. Certainly after I started developing actions, I really realized I just wasn't happy with the native library that Google provided for it. And it rapidly got even more confusing when Google ended up providing 2 libraries, one specifically for actions and one for dialogue flow. And I wasn't sure why they were doing it this way. And a lot of what I was finding was that the libraries that I had seen were very procedure driven. So if I have an intent and it calls my webhook, and I should emphasize that this is a library specifically for webhooks. If my webhook was called, it was expected to trigger a function or a handler function. And the end of that handler function was expected to add output. So it was expected to say something, or say something and close the channel. And usually that's what the method that we were calling was. It was, you know, say and some string. And that felt backwards to me, because more and more I realized as we've been developing modern web apps, we're more configuration driven, we're more template driven. And we're more internationalization driven. And if I wanted to do templating or internationalization with this kind of procedure, I now have to call other libraries. And that just started seeming like a lot to me. So multivocal started as a way to say, by default, you're going to send some output. So by default, define that output, and define that output as a template. Just like, you know, if we were writing a React app, we're writing a template and we're kind of filling stuff into it. We're writing Angular, we're writing a template and we're putting our values into that template. That's a more modern way that we have of doing web and mobile programming these days. So there are still functions, but those functions are very strictly delegated to generating values, generating what we would sometimes call business logic. And that's kind of at the heart of what multivocal is it's a templating infrastructure that, as much as possible, tries to do things by default for you.
Yeah, no, I very much got the feeling that it was, you know, template first, separation of concerns when it comes to your interaction. So your output coming back. Jovo is very much that you say something, your webhook gets called, the intent handler gets called, you do some stuff, and then the last part is you specify what the output's going to
Right.
be.
And that's what everyone's library tends to do. And
yeah.
while I understand that, I think it's backwards from what we need to be getting towards.
I know it's very interesting.
Because as I started working on multivocal, I realized more and more that I wanted to push as much as I could into a configuration. Because when I put it in a configuration, I can now more dynamically change things. So so if I need to change a phrase on something that's been deployed, I don't have to recompile as long as I just change my configuration file. And this started getting into my, what we've been talking about for a long time now with audio content management systems.
Yes.
Which we'll talk about another day.
Yeah, that is a whole 2 or 3
at least
or 4,
another topic.
Yeah.
But then I started realizing more and more things that I wanted in the configuration made sense there. So, we were talking about prosody. And that's, like you, I can never remember what the right tags are, when the right things were, any of that. But it made sense to me that sometimes I might want to reply one way, and sometimes I might want to reply in a different voice. And rather than code that into the template to respond, that's a setting that you set for a particular response. So I can define a bunch of voices and say, use voice A for this reply and use voice B for this other reply.
Yeah, that falls very much in, Heidi Culbertson. She does a lot of research with responses coming back based on the age or the hearing level of the person that's getting the response, and so interacting with voice assistants. So that's interesting to have more of a global setting or configuration that can learn over time and affect the overall rate of rate and pitch, because as you get older, the less you hear, less high pitched stuff. So affecting that, it does make sense, I think, to be able to do that more in a global setting as opposed to this particular clump of SSML is going to have the rate of
right. And you can do it on pretty much any level you want. So one of the actions that I built as a test one will talk to you in one of 6 different voices. Each voice has a different name, and you can ask for a different name, and it'll switch to that name and start talking to you in that voice instead. And all of that's, 90% of that is handled by the library, where it makes sense, because you don't need to deal with all of these different voices.
Yeah, no, I like that idea. Do you have plans on having multivocal be multi-platform?
Well, it is multi-platform, sort of.
Okay,
sort of. So one of the things we just released within the past month was support for Action Builder, which is a completely different JSON protocol than the Dialogflow protocol, webhook protocol. That rewrite took me about 2 hours.
Oh, okay.
So one of the things that I ended up doing was eventually saying, well, if everything's just a template, then all my responses are just templates with templates. So the response protocol just is a bunch of templates. And the input is a bunch of configurations of where to get parameters from. So, there's a bunch of configuration files that say when you're getting the user's parameters, look in these possible locations. So, and, the dialog flows will be in this location, and actions on Google will be in this other location. And we standardize it into a single standardized structure for all platforms. So as part of that project, I made actions, I added actions on Google's Actions Builder. And then I also added Google's chatbot system, which interacts with Dialogflow. So officially it's Dialogflow, but it's got a very different set of output parameters. So yes, in theory, and my goal is to have it so that it can work with an Alexa, as an Alexa webhook and as an Actions Builder webhook at the same time.
Okay.
And technically, there's not a huge, there's very little technical problem in doing that. It's more familiarity and time and so forth.
That's something that occurred to me, which is interesting, is working with Jovo. They're very pluggable. You know, it started out that they supported, you know, Alexa and Google, but then they you know, and they're moving to Jovo version 2 and enhancing now with version 3. They've made it so that you plug in the Google handler, like the Google engine and the Alexa engine and you know, Twilio, and they've got a whole bunch of, you know, group of different ways that you can get the input and the response, and all the, you know, the handler stuff and everything follows along very nicely with those. So that you can, you know, share a lot of the same code. They also have a really good middlewares where you can plug in at different steps during their pipeline to do different things, as well as plugins, and this growing library of people writing plugins. What would be interesting, this would be the first time I think that would be done, would be to see about plugging in, I guess, writing a plugin that is the multivocal system. So the templating, the opinionated configuration, that type of thing into that. So you take advantage of the backbone that they already have for the multi-platform stuff, but then you would plug in this new templating approach. I guess my gut says that it feels like it could be done, and it could be pretty awesome. It may not be the direction you want to go, but
it's one of those interesting questions, and it's probably more if I had been more exposed to Jovo before I started the library, or started what eventually became Multivocal, I might have gone that sort of a route. And I might still someday go that route, but it would require, I think, a very deep understanding of Jovo for me to move it over. And in the meantime, I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other.
Yeah.
You know, so right now I'm okay with having them as two separate projects, where we start seeing, you know, people who are doing more with Jovo saying, why aren't we having more of a internationalized template system as part of this? And people asking me more, well, how do I plug in? Where do I get, you know, where do I plug in the modules? Why don't you have a bigger module library?
right.
And, you know, so I think right now we're at a stage where there are good lessons. I think right now we're still early enough that exploring these two options as separate options is the right way to go, because otherwise we're going to get bogged down in trying to build the perfect thing. And right now, both camps are still experimenting.
Yeah, I think I think we're still learning how to do this cross-platform thing. So I do want to ask you about speech markdown and multivocal, so don't let me forget about that. But one of the things that I guess that I've been wondering about is, shoot, now I just lost what I was thinking. I got, you know what, let's talk about the multivocal thing. Maybe I'll think about it again.
So speech markdown in multivocal. Since I first saw you talking about speech markdown, I have had this pretty clear vision about how I wanted to put it into multivocal. The biggest barrier I've had is finding the right label for it. Because in multivocal, when by default, you can just specify a list of responses, and it automatically turns those into text responses. And in the future, I'll say, okay, turn those into markdown responses, unless you set it to turn it into something else. Or you can also specify text and SSML separately, or text and SSML as a single response. And this lets you do things like, in some cases, show text, in some cases, say something slightly different. I want to be able to make a third tag for speech markdown, so you can do the same sort of thing.
Yeah, so what's interesting is the concept of going from speech markdown to SSML. There is this intermediate step. This right now it's an abstract syntax tree so all of the things that all the speech markdown gets converted into this abstract syntax tree. Or, you know, easier just thinking about some intermediate format, and then a formatter is applied to say format that as Alexa flavored SSML or Google flavored SSML, or I have one for text. So what it does is it strips all of the tags out, and then you just have the text. So that would be a situation where if you wanted to show something or show the same thing of what you said, then you could use that. And I still need to do some additions to it. There's,
right.
You know, we're at version 1, but there's still some additional things to add. Go ahead, what's your question?
So the catch though is that sometimes you want to say something different than what you show.
Yes, and that's where a sub tag would come in.
So here's and I just had this conversation with a linguist as well. There are even some cases where a sub tag isn't the right thing to use. So for example, if you are reading out a list, you may read out a list of 5 items, or sorry, read out a list of 3 items, but show a list of 5 items.
Yes.
Or there may be other dramatic change, you know, relatively dramatic changes between the two, where it's sometimes just easier to say, this is what you're going to show, and this is what you're going to say.
That's true. I would agree that that's
right. So that's why multivocal supports both text and SSML labeling of stuff. So I want to introduce a new label for Markdown, for speech Markdown, which I am tentatively thinking of calling Mark. Simply because it's 4 letters. And so it lines up nicely with speech, with text and SSML.
Okay, that's what sounds good to me.
But definitely, my goal is to incorporate speech Markdown as one of the default methods that's built into it, because I think it's an invaluable way to express things.
Yeah. So the thing that I wanted to talk about was APLA.
Yes.
So Alexa presentation language for audio. The reason why I'm talking about that in conjunction with speech Markdown and SSML is that one of the custom tags that Google added to SSML was to play multiple audio files in parallel, something that you couldn't do, or still can't with SSML on Alexa. So it's not something that's in the SSML spec. It's a special tag that Google added just for their SSML, and it had gone unanswered for a long time. One of those things that Alexa developers wanted, like, hey, look, Google has it, we don't, and we didn't hear anything. And then at Alexa Live a few weeks ago, it was announced that this APLA was going to have this new directive, which is different than an SSML response in the Alexa world, but that will do the same type of thing. So what typically happens when the response comes back and it's SSML is that it comes back to the middle layer, whether it be the Alexa service or the Google service, and that gets translated into audio, and then the audio file is sent to the device and played. What typically happens with a directive is that it's an out of band, it's outside of the, it's still part of the response, but it's outside of the output, the typical output.
It's meant to be handled more locally.
Yeah, and it's supposed to be like going all the way down to the device, and the device itself handles that directive and does it. But what I learned this last week is that actually in the case of this parallel audio mixer tag and APLA, is that actually it's the middle layer of the Alexa service that still converts that into audio, and it's still the audio coming back. So doesn't seem like they had to do much on the changing of the code that's running on the devices to support APLA, because it's still in the end.
Very interesting.
So they could have just as easily, I guess, did a custom SSML tag to do it, because it's equivalently the same.
I have guesses about why they didn't, but I don't know Alexa's. I don't know Amazon's structure well enough to know their internal politics. Let's put it that way.
So what that makes it interesting too for things like speech Markdown. So now is speech Markdown going to stay the SSML way of doing things, or is it going to need to handle something a little bit different? Right now, I think I'm going to stick with just SSML. It's valuable enough the way that it is. But
so an interesting thought that occurs to me is that it might still be reasonable to leave it as SSML, but possibly output a second object, and that
yeah,
second object would be what you pass to APLA on Alexa's side, and what you don't need to do that on Google's side. So you once again you maintain this compatibility layer, and you're just outputting two different things.
yeah, that's true. Quick story of practical use of speech markdown. So here's a project I had that I had already started working on it for Alexa and Google, and it had I hadn't converted it yet to speech markdown. It was using SSML tags, and there were probably about 10, 15 different SSML tags that I was using, and they were sprinkled throughout my text-to-speech responses coming back, and I started working on adding Bixby to it. And so immediately it broke, because there are very few tags that Bixby supports at this point in time, and they'll get there. I'm not too worried about it. But what I ended up doing is just going ahead and switching it over to use speech markdown. Wrote a formatter for Bixby that pretty much just returned text for everything except for the few tags that they supported. And after a few hours of just getting that implemented, then I was able to flip the switch, and now everything was using speech markdown, and and just move on. And that was a case where I'm like, yes, this is exactly what I was wanting it to do.
No, I know that feeling. When I was porting Multivocal over to support the Actions Builder, it really was just here's the list of features, and here's the formats that they need. And the first time I tested it, I'm like, wow, this worked.
this is pretty cool. So I'm very grateful for the different people that have helped with speech markdown. There's a whole website now. You can go to speechmarkdown.org, and it talks about what the formatting, the syntax language is. There's various open source projects. There's a plugin now for Visual Studio Code where if you include speech markdown in strings or other files, that it does some syntax highlighting. There's still features to implement in speech markdown. I just hit something today where I have to change the URL format of what can additionally be supported in an audio tag to get that to work. So there's lots to do.
That's one of the great things, and also one of the great challenges with open source projects is, on one hand, it's great when people are there and helping you out and contributing stuff, including contributing bug reports. That's useful as well.
Yep.
But it's also, you're now managing this project.
Yeah. So when I did my slides, when I first talked about this at Voice Summit a year and a half ago, that I had this picture of, I felt like I was working on these ideas. I was like pushing the boulder up the hill, and then I got done and I was like, yes. And then I felt like Atlas with like the whole world on my shoulders now, because now you've got this project that you're managing, and you feel like I'm just one person, and can I do this? And so love the people that have supported and helped that. There's still more to do. I'd love to, I invite you. I'm sure Alan would invite anybody on his project to come join along and help push the boundaries of voice dev and keep improving things.
Yep. We will have links to our projects in the comments section.
Yeah, that sounds good. As always, Alan, this has been a great conversation.
Always fun.
Yeah, great success on your project. I was able to look at it, and I'm excited for its progress.
And like I said, we just had a new update just come out, and next one, I will really try to get speech markdown incorporated. I really feel good about it this round.
All right, sounds good. Let me know if I can help you out. I'm willing to help you here.
I certainly will.
All right. Well, take care, everybody. Thanks for listening to Two Voice Devs.
Thanks for listening. Two Voice Devs.